Let us pray. Dear Lord, source of all things good and challenging, give us the strength to survive and support one another, to navigate through these trying times in a manner that leaves no one behind. Help us see clearly through muddy waters. Help us reach out an open hand to clench the hands of our brothers, our sisters, our human family, and everyone that is involved and impacted by this torrent of problems that we have in this world. We ask for your guidance. We ask for your support. We come to you in peace. Amen. My name is Yusef Miller of the San Diego Regional Interfaith Collaborative, and I want to welcome you all here, those of you in person and those of our family and friends online, to our Responding to Traumatic Events, a Toolbox for Faith Leaders. This is an important topic, and we want to make sure that we reach out to everyone in our region and whoever is in sound and in reach of our voices to make sure that we can navigate these torrent of issues. We're faced with COVID-19 that affects our schools, our businesses, our entertainment. We're faced with complications of the George Floyd era and police reform, the insurrection on January 6th at the Capitol, wildfires in San Diego, environmental injustices, and so much more. It is hard for me as a seasoned veteran to deal with all of these things simultaneously. What about our children? What about people who have not experienced such a overlap of traumas? How do they navigate such an issue? This is not one issue, but many. And each one can be very overbearing. So we cannot forget that there are those people who see us every day, masked or unmasked, with smiles on their faces, walking around in their average day, but the weight of the world is on their shoulders. How do we navigate? How do we deal with this? Well, today is a topic on how we navigate. I would like to introduce Sandi Morrison. She is the CEO of the Institute on Violence, Abuse, and Trauma. We want to get advice and navigation from her and her expertise. Her institute is very critical throughout San Diego and many other places. And we have attended and seen all of the good, all of the advice that can come from this and improve our situations as we go forward. So I'd like to introduce to you now, Sandi Morrison.
Thank you, everyone. Good morning. It's such an honor to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you today. Thank you especially to Pastor Jerry and Daniel and Yusuf and all that were involved in helping bring this important opportunity for us to talk and learn together about how we can learn more about trauma and add to our toolboxes to help address the very many, as you said so eloquently, Yusuf, the very many traumatic things that are happening simultaneously right now. So I appreciate the time to be here with you today. Some of the topics we're going to discuss are difficult and painful, so please do what you need to do to take care of yourselves as we spend this time together. So some of the things I hope that we'll learn from the discussion today is about how we can increase faith leaders' understanding of root causes and impacts of trauma, looking at historical and intergenerational trauma especially. Also, we're going to talk a little bit, mostly an introduction to the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, which helps us understand what happens in childhood, how it has psychological and physical and spiritual impacts that travel with people throughout their lives. We're also going to talk about ways to strengthen resilience and how to better recognize both symptoms of trauma as well as signs of post-traumatic growth and how we can support that, how we can build trauma-informed and trauma-responsive environments in our faith community. I just want to tell you briefly about myself and about IVAT. IVAT is the Institute on Violence, Abuse, and Trauma. We're a nonprofit based here in San Diego, but we do work nationally and internationally, addressing mainly forms of interpersonal violence. So IVAT has a direct services department where we provide psychological and forensic services to children and adults. We also have a trainings arm where we host international summits, one here in San Diego every fall and one in Hawaii every spring. We have the ability to offer continuing education to help people advance their licensures. And we also are involved in dissemination through 3 internationally peer-reviewed journals. So we do work related to all forms of trauma, domestic violence, sexual violence, child abuse, human trafficking, trauma in the military. And we train disciplines, but we do a lot of multidisciplinary work to help people learn from each other, share resources, find different ways of supporting individuals, families, and communities. I have a master's in counseling psychology. I've been involved in nonprofit work for almost 30 years, and it has all been related to reducing and preventing these different forms of interpersonal violence and how we help validate people's experiences of trauma and the different journeys that we all take when we're healing and the different ways that healing comes about and how we can do our part to advance that. So we're going to spend a little bit of time first kind of talking about trauma. There's different definitions, there's different meanings, there's different labels, there's different understandings. So the technical definition of trauma is an event, series of events, or set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. The important thing to think about in terms of trauma and when people experience trauma is it can be an actual experience of physical threat, perhaps, or it could be something that's imagined. You're in fear of something happening, or somebody has threatened that something will happen to you. It's important to think too about trauma is a very Western word. So as I mentioned, we do a lot of work in Hawaii and with other indigenous populations around the world. And in my Hawaii summit earlier this year, one of my colleagues who's a practitioner in Canada and is a First Nations person spoke about how trauma in the Native American community is often described as injury where the blood does not flow. And that stopped me right in my tracks to think about. We often get really stuck in what's visible, right? What's obvious, what we can see. And so a lot of what I want us to think about in the time together is there's invisible and visible injury, there's moral injury, there's a lot of layers to trauma. So thinking about how we can expand our definition and our language about trauma as well as healing is a really important piece. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with Gabor Mate's work. He is a medical doctor up in Canada. He's done a lot of work around addictions. He does a lot of primary care with addicted people in Toronto especially, but he travels internationally talking about trauma and not only the connection of trauma to addiction, but particularly this as trauma as a psychic wound that hardens you psychologically and interferes with your ability to grow and develop. It pains you now and you're acting out of pain, which is one of those trauma responses that I want us to pay attention to. We might call them bad kids or kids that act out, right? When we're missing the actual recognition of traumatic symptoms, people experiencing fear and anger. Trauma is not what happens to you, but it's what happens inside you as a result of what has happened to you, which is another way of pushing a little bit, sort of the trauma-informed paradigm, which is really talking about it's not what's wrong with a person, it's what happened to that person. What did that person experience? if we look at our language, we can help reduce the blame and the shame and the judgment that a lot of people that have experienced interpersonal violence and other forms of trauma are dealing with. So thinking about what trauma does to us holistically, mind, body, and spirit. Trauma is that scarring that makes you less flexible, more rigid, less feeling, and more defended. So again, thinking about how we interact with people and the kind of shields and protections that we put up that oftentimes aren't helpful or healing for us, but it's a defense mechanism. How do we as faith communities help people feel safe and feel that this is a welcoming space where even if I don't share all of my story, I know that you recognize that there's a lot more going on than often meets the eye. The other thing that I have that is helpful about listening to Gabor Mate's work and in the realm of Hungry Ghosts, this picture of this book he's put up here is fabulous, is he was born in Budapest, Hungary in 1944. His maternal grandparents were killed in Auschwitz when he was only 5 months old. His aunt disappeared and his father endured forced labor at the hands of the Nazis. He immigrated to Canada with his family in 1956, and he speaks about how his mother gave him to a neighbor to keep him safe, and how that was an incredibly difficult choice that she needed to make in that time, and how it saved his life, and they were reunited afterward. But what that detachment, particularly at such a young age, did, and the scarring that he still and his family still carry around. So again, thinking about historical trauma, the layers of trauma. This is also, Peter Levine is another famous trauma researcher who talks about somatic experiencing teaches us that trauma is not caused by the event itself, right? Sometimes we focus on the event and fixing the event, but rather develops by the failure of the mind, body, spirit, and nervous system to process these extreme adverse life events. So part of the understanding of trauma is that it's not just talking that helps us. It's about helping people learn how to release that trauma that is physically stored in our bodies, and how we can do combinations of interventions and creating opportunities for people to both talk and process, but also physically release that pain. Resmaa Menakem is a social worker based in Minnesota who does a lot of work around racialized healing and recognizing that there's the impacts of racism on everything, systemic and otherwise. And one of the things that I really resonated with in his description of trauma is thinking about when one group oppresses or victimizes another and people are suffering trauma, we pass that trauma on to our children. And he called it a soul wound, which again, just similar to an injury where blood does not flow. Deep, deep pain that oftentimes people have difficulty talking about or admitting to or sharing about. And if that is happening and we're not helping intervene and help those people process and heal from trauma, we're going to be creating an intergenerational cycle, which some would argue is there anyway when we think about epigenetics and what we experience and what that stress of trauma does biologically to our bodies. Think about a woman who is pregnant and is experiencing domestic violence, for example, and the stress of being in that violent relationship, what that biologically is doing to the child that she is carrying and everything that comes with that, right? Think about Native Americans and the Holocaust, and especially you as faith leaders with histories of lots of persecution and violence and discrimination in your worlds. So how do we do our best to name it, to validate it, to help people recognize it, and do our best to teach people how to heal so we can interrupt that intergenerational transmission of violence? So there's different types of trauma. You've probably heard of some of these. Shout out for me, and maybe whoever's can help monitor the chat, just share the types of trauma that come to mind for you. Yusuf mentioned a few just now. COVID, what was that? PTSD, yep. What are other things that contributes to trauma, create trauma? Refugees, separation of children from their families on the border. What else? Imprisonment, absolutely. Family abuse. Exposure to gun violence, which has hit our faith communities locally here especially. So there's lots of different types of trauma. Post-traumatic stress disorder is one of the most common forms of trauma that people are familiar with, largely because that thinking came out of a lot of work with military veterans initially. But then it was then applied to the experience of individuals that were victims of domestic violence in prolonged violent relationships. When we think about that as well with child abuse or children exposed. So there's medical trauma, there's trauma from natural disasters, thinking about the trauma from COVID, thinking about the trauma from children not being in schools for a year and a half, thinking about these many, many different layers that contribute to trauma. Developmental trauma or adverse childhood experiences is trauma that impacts development, particularly of children and their developing brains. And looking at, we have to look at the different causes of stress that lead to interference with development, whether it be physical development, psychological development, or actual biological development. There's also transgenerational trauma, as I mentioned, where cultures and communities are experiencing collective trauma, enduring trauma, complex trauma, meaning more than one event that is traumatic. And it's literally imprinted on our DNA, and we pass that on and on and on. So the hope here is to better recognize the different forms of trauma, to bring it into our conversations more, to help destigmatize it and help people realize I can be seen, I can be heard, my experience can be validated. And this is not something to be shamed about. This is not something to feel that I'm alone in, because sadly, especially when we get into looking at adverse childhood experiences, there are a lot of things creating trauma in our daily lives. And the more we can talk about it, the more we can break that silence, the better we can help people begin to heal. So we talked about post-traumatic stress disorder as one of the more common forms that people are familiar with. One of the hallmarks of post-traumatic stress disorder is that people have flashbacks, which means a memory of the traumatic event comes out of nowhere, and they feel like they are literally reliving that moment. It's very disorganizing, it's very discombobulating. Oftentimes people who have been maybe in therapy or getting professional help feel like they've taken 10 steps forward, and then all of a sudden they have a flashback and they feel like they're all the way back at square one. Post-traumatic stress also is where you notice people being very hypervigilant. They are always waiting for that next bad thing to happen. We're going to talk a little bit about biologically what happens when you're hypervigilant and how that activates all sorts of things in our bodies. That when that's happening on a regular, for a chronic period of time, is what leads to some of these health impacts that we need to get better at making the connections around. Depression, nausea, insomnia, headaches, these are all common things that are symptoms that we see from post-traumatic stress disorder. Complex trauma is something that we see a little more when you're talking about children, for example, that are growing up in abusive households. And then because of the vulnerability by experiencing that abuse in such a young age, are more vulnerable, are at higher risk for experiencing violence in adult relationships. So complex trauma involves more than one traumatic thing is happening to you over a prolonged period of time. And unfortunately, it's usually by someone that's supposed to be protecting and caring for you. So that dichotomy, particularly in a child's brain, about the person that's supposed to love me is hurting me, is part of the hallmark of complex trauma. Our goals always, always, always are to help increase protective factors, relationships, supportive, safe, healing relationships, which is what you as faith leaders are creating and providing all the time, and is such a critical piece. You couldn't be better positioned to be the best trauma-informed advocates of most disciplines. And I've trained a lot of people on these topics. It's naturally what you're doing, what you're creating, what you're providing. So it's our priority to reduce the re-traumatization. And part of that, again, is by not waiting for people to have to spell it out for us, right? To recognize when people are struggling and not to ask them to detail it all over again. sometimes it isn't about retelling the story. Sometimes it's about showing that we recognize there's struggle there and not making someone go through all those details again, because we come to the table trauma informed. So some of the signs of trauma, and please feel free to shout out, throw in the chat, other signs of trauma as you think about the people you've worked with, yourself, your loved ones. Addictive behaviors, which is why I started off with Gabor Mate, because a lot of people don't make the connection between trauma and addiction, right? People are suffering, people are in pain. They're trying to push down that trauma and that pain through the use or abuse of different substances. Also having incredible inability to resolve conflicts with others, because oftentimes you can't handle that tension, right? There's already enough conflict you're going to avoid as much as you can. All or nothing thinking, when you're working with people, that it's this or that and there's no gray area in between, right? That's another sign of trauma. Eating disorders, changes in eating habits, changing in sleeping habits. Some of the behaviors we'll see that might be, again, as I mentioned before, not a healthy coping mechanism, but might be self-destructive. That's where inappropriate attachments comes in. Being around people that are not supporting your growth and your health, but are doing the opposite. And sometimes you might recognize it if someone has a really unexplained fear of a person, a place, or a thing that they may not be able to articulate, and it might seem really odd. So take a step back and say, all right, what's driving this there? Is there a comment? Yes.
Yeah, we also have a couple of comments from online about acting out of self-destructiveness, brain fog.
Yep.
I don't know if you would repeat those two.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Acting out or self-destructiveness and brain fog were some other examples and signs of trauma. Yes. Yep. Absolutely. Attachment disorder or afraid to trust other people because the trusted people violated that trust. Absolutely. Yes. Depression, 100%. Anxiety, fear, being tentative, being very introverted, trying to self-protect, not being able to handle intense feelings. Yes. Absolutely. We're going to talk about the neurobiology of trauma just briefly, and that's a very important point. I worked with a lot of domestic violence and sexual assault survivors who were constantly criticized for not being able to tell their story from A to Z. And we're going to learn about how the impact of trauma on our memory is the reason for that. It's not a linear process. We don't, and so for example, and someone that's interviewing a victim might feel like that the jumping around in their story, the inability to focus means, oh, maybe there's something we shouldn't trust here, right? Rather than a trauma-informed response is recognizing the impact on concentration and focus and memory from what happens to our bodies in trauma. Looking at someone who's really irritable or maybe bounces back and forth between, different psychological states, really happy, really frustrated, really sad. Someone that's not feeling hopefulness. A big piece of victimization and traumatization is blaming yourself. So how do we kind of set that straight? How do we validate and normalize and help people put the onus of responsibility where it belongs? It's important to think about signs of trauma, which are outward and usually more what other people see, and symptoms that are more inward, are more how we're feeling about ourselves, that not feeling that we can trust people, that not feeling that we can have intimacy with people, not feeling safe to have affection with people, decreased concentration, as someone mentioned, that feeling of numbing, not putting myself out there is a self-protective measure. It impacts our memories in many, many different ways. And it's an emotional overwhelm that leads people to have difficulty performing their job or performing in school or taking care of their families. And again, that's where a lot of labels and stigma and shame can come from. So if we can help people connect those dots and recognize that this is not about someone just being a bad kid, as I said earlier, right? I don't believe in bad kids. I believe in children that are suffering from something who need appropriate interventions. And the same is true of adults. Any other examples of signs or symptoms of trauma that are coming to mind as we talk through some of this? Emotional outbursts, absolutely. There was kind of talk about acting out or aggression, maybe feeling withdrawn or frozen, not wanting to engage with people, having a very flat affect, which can be difficult, right? It's hard to get people sometimes to feel safe enough to tell you what's going on, even if they're engaged in community in other ways. Looks like there's a hand raised. Sonia, did you have a comment or a question?
Yes, I was hoping that you can clarify. I liked how you identified the difference of signs and symptoms, and where you have signs are outward and then the symptoms are inward. So this diagram that you have to the right, is everything outside? Is that considered the signs? And then
It's actually a mixture of both. It's actually a mixture of both. So a sign is going to be something like a nightmare, that someone sees you having a nightmare, a physical response, right? A symptom would be more a feeling of low self-worth, low self-esteem, where that's what I'm internally feeling, but it may be less obvious to the outside world. So that's kind of, so the image is a description of both, actually.
so could you give another example of an inward symptom, and then an outward?
Absolutely. Another example of an inward symptom would be a feeling of numbing, where I just I'm not feeling happy. I'm not feeling sad. I've put a real buffer around myself so I don't feel anything at all. So that's going to be inward, right? It's going to be harder for, not that inward doesn't mean there's some indications if people are paying attention, but numbing is an internal process. That's a self-protective measure. And a more a sign would be something like aggressive behavior, acting out behavior, where you may not understand the root cause of it as trauma, but you see someone that's really having a lot of this anger and aggression that they're outwardly expressing. Does that help clarify it a little bit? Great, thank you. Yes. Yes. Yep, absolutely. Avoidance of conflict is another common one. That's very, very good example. So here's Resma Menakem again, his book, My Grandmother's Hands, I highly recommend. It's partly for clinicians, but it has really helpful information for everyone and just better understanding, especially systemic racism and historical trauma. I like his thinking here about trauma is not a flaw or a weakness. It's actually a highly effective tool of safety and survival. Trauma is not an event, it's a process, it's a protective response. And part of what people get confused about is trauma activates our fight or our flight or our freeze biological responses. And I've worked with sexual assault survivors, for example, who look back and say, I didn't do enough. I didn't kick hard enough. I didn't scream hard enough. I didn't fight hard enough. What is most instrumental in helping with healing some of that trauma is helping them recognize that their body automatically responded to protect self in the best way it knew how. And more often than not, that's what allowed them to escape that situation and survive, right? But there's a lot of criticism of self. So looking at trauma and how trauma manifests itself in our bodies and how we can find various ways of unlocking that, including paying attention to cultural practices and traditions. And I'd encourage you to think about, are there cultural and religious practices and traditions that help address trauma? And are there some that hinder people that are experiencing trauma and aren't able to receive the support and the validation and the community that they need? So whenever we're talking about trauma and healing, it's important to also think about intersectionality and really paying attention to the many different parts of ourselves, some of which we bring to the table in our interactions, in our faith communities or in our professions, and some of which are hidden for reasons that because they may not feel safe, they may not feel respected, they may not feel validated. So thinking about, this is a feminist theory by Kimberly Crenshaw. Think about how intersectionality impacts a person's experience of trauma. How does my religious background impact that traumatic experience? My gender, my education, my status, whether I'm an immigrant or a refugee. If I tell you these things are happening to me, is that going to put me more at risk? Is that another layer of trauma that I'm surrounded with and impacted by? So I think about Audre Lorde's comment about we aren't single people issue and we don't live single issue lives. So thinking about this again from a holistic perspective, how can we make sure we're being as welcoming and as honoring of all parts of people in our communities as possible? Here's a few other examples of impacts of trauma. Keep in mind there are short and long-term impacts. Sometimes people, experience an initial kind of flood of feeling, and then they can process through and they can move on. Other times, as we talk about ACEs in a minute here, you'll see that people are having serious, serious health conditions because of unprocessed trauma, and they aren't aware of those connections, right? So the more that, again, we can get more disciplines trained up on recognizing these signs and these symptoms, not creating it as a judgmental situation, but what's happened to someone? How can we help you address what's happened? How can we provide that support? So some of what you see, especially with children, is reenactment of trauma. You see it in their play a lot. You see sometimes, and I'm sorry that a lot of my examples are interpersonal violence. That's the work that I've done, but you see it when a rape trauma survivor goes back to the bar where she was assaulted over and over and over again, fixated on the problem in a way of trying to come back and have some sort of control over it. These are traumatic experiences. Clearly a loss of safety, a feeling that danger is always around the corner, a connection to your physical self, your physical body. Oftentimes in traumatic experiences, the body is literally the scene of a crime. And how does that impact how someone starts to heal, starts to feel empowered, starts to feel that they have a choice and that they're walking through the world, they have some control over that. I mentioned shame. Disassociation is another mechanism of trying to separate from self in the moment that something violent or traumatic is happening. And a lot of this people get stuck in these kind of unhealthy coping mechanisms, whether it be related to eating or use of substances or that depression we talked about. Maybe it's feelings of self-harm, that hypervigilance. Think about how exhausting it is to go through our day-to-day. Now imagine going through day-to-day, constantly waiting for that next shoe to drop and constantly walking on eggshells and constantly feeling like I've got to look out because something else is coming bad that's going to happen to me. It's exhausting. It's exhausting. But here's how we can look at how do we do a better job as faith leaders, as members of different parts of our community, in being more aware of what trauma. Yes, I'd be happy to. Trauma awareness is the key here in looking at how do we expand our understanding of trauma so that we can do our part to create more trauma-informed situations. Good? All right. So part of that is talking about what is trauma and where does it come from? How can I be more responsive, more receptive, more welcoming of people that have experienced traumatic events? How do I do a better job of recognizing possible trauma responses? Not to label, not to diagnose, but to show that we understand that this is unfortunately very prevalent, that many of us have significant trauma histories that we may or may not have had any help with or any intervention with along the way. So the goal is not only how can we help others, but also being trauma informed means paying attention to the impact of working with trauma on ourselves. And how can we model good self-care and good practices, including spirituality and faith and religious activities. That's a grounding point for so many people that are suffering and experiencing trauma, holding on to that faith and that spirituality. So if the faith community is more mindful and bringing, I understand the impacts of trauma to the table, you're going to have a lot more people being able to open up and let go of some of that and heal, because healing happens in relationships. So I mentioned neurobiology of trauma. That's a whole day-long training of its own, but an important thing if you're interested in this to learn about more, because as I started off with, trauma isn't just about talk therapy. Trauma isn't just about sitting down and telling you all the bad things that happened to me, right? Trauma is about people recognizing that, particularly for children that are experiencing trauma, whose brains are still developing. Traumatic stress, toxic stress interrupts that development. So a real brief tutorial on this is thinking about our brains develop from bottom up. So the bottom part of the brain, the first part of the brain to form, is where our autonomic functions happening, our breathing, those fight, flight, or freeze responses, literally based in survival. The midbrain is where our emotions and our memories come in, where more of that, feeling and awareness. And then the frontal part of our brain is where more of that executive thinking, that logical thought comes in. When someone is experiencing trauma, no matter what, they are operating from the base of the brain, from that survival response, not, is this a good idea? Should I go here? Should I do that? They are in fight, flight, or freeze, which can often be immobilizing, right? As I mentioned earlier. So trauma triggers those physical responses. It shuts down the higher functioning parts of our brain. And that's the piece that we need to really think about when we're talking about, why is this person not taking advantage of the resources that I've shared with them, right? Why is this child not feeling safe enough to go back to school the next day after mom and dad have been arguing at night? Thinking again about this is the neurobiology of trauma. These are not made up situations. These are severe interactions between body, mind, spirit. So I'm going to play this video, which is one of the best I have seen in many years of doing trauma work, to help kind of really show not only the impact on the brain, but also different ways that we can help ground people when we notice that they're experiencing trauma in different ways, shapes, or forms. So this is about an 8-minute video, and it's from Scotland. So hopefully the sound is up loud enough and everybody will be able to hear okay.
We need to take a statement so we can establish what happened on Saturday night.
What time did you get back to David's flat?
What time? I don't know.
Can you give us an estimate?
I don't remember.
Would your pals remember what time you left the club?
He seemed nice.
She didn't remember much, did she?
I know. And now we've got to waste more time on a daft lecture. We know how to deal with victims. We've had years of experience.
Well, some of us have had more years than others.
I'm in my prime, I'll have you know.
That'll be right.
Today's session is about trauma. The latest in brain science will help you in your work. I'll start with a tour of the parts of the human brain. The reptilian brain maintains basic bodily functions. The limbic system is also instinctive. It deals with fear and pleasure. For example, you pat a dog, it senses pleasure, and without thinking, wags its tail. The neocortex is the site of logic, imagination, planning, and control. It's more sophisticated, but because it's conscious, it's slower than the older parts of the brain. The amygdala is a key part of the limbic system. It has one job: to sense danger and set off the alarm. When it's a matter of survival, the primitive parts of the brain override the conscious part. There are 3 possible survival responses: fight, flight, or the one that people don't think of, freeze. When the alarm goes off, blood and oxygen are diverted to muscles, adrenaline floods the body, and all systems that are not crucial to survival are switched off. Normally, the job of the hippocampus is to file memories so you can retrieve them later. But in times of danger, it stops filing memories, which makes it harder to gather evidence later on. Instead, the hippocampus switches to pumping cortisol. What's useful about cortisol is it stops us feeling pain, so we can focus on survival. Can anyone give me an example?
A farming accident where a man carried his own arm for a mile without feeling any pain?
Yes, excellent example. It is an evolutionary safety mechanism which is fast and instinctive. In essence, it's our body's very clever way of protecting us. To recap, an example of the three parts of the brain working together. You're standing at a bar. Your reptilian brain is keeping your heart beating. You're enjoying the pleasure of a nice pint with your limbic system. You're using your neocortex to work out if there's time for another before the last train. What could happen to make the amygdala kick in? What if this happened? The way you'd respond would depend not on your logical brain, but on your instinctive brain. Being glassed in a bar would be a traumatic experience. Who can give me another example of an event that can cause trauma?
War?
Rape?
A car crash?
Good, yes. Trauma occurs when a person is overwhelmed by something beyond their control. The survival brain takes over the rational brain. It can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, with symptoms that last at least a month. Vicarious or secondary trauma is something you may experience if you deal with incidents such as rape or sudden death, or think of Lockerbie, Dunblane. You're not superheroes. Having a brain makes you all vulnerable to secondary trauma. It's important to understand that when trauma occurs again and again, it can become complex PTSD, such as in domestic abuse or child sexual abuse. The alarm system in the brain becomes jammed. Memories are stuck in the limbic system, so a trigger can set off the alarm. The trigger could be anything: a colour, a smell, a sound, a sensation. Now, the indicators of trauma. What should you be looking out for?
Depression? Crying a lot?
Yes, that's one response. And at the other end of the spectrum, total numbness.
Nightmares? Flashbacks?
Stress?
Good, yes. And they may feel sick. Also, shame, feelings of guilt, inability to enjoy sex, social isolation, triggers. People often feel overwhelmed by the symptoms of trauma. This can lead to using alcohol or other drugs to block out memories, or self-harm, or dissociation when a person's mind detaches from reality. Indicators can be specific to the type of trauma. Say, dental problems, when someone who was orally abused avoids going to the dentist. A victim of abuse might bond strongly to her abuser. This is known as traumatic bonding, or Stockholm syndrome. And jumbled up memory, when a person's normal recording of memories doesn't work. Can you recall any times you've seen that symptom?
What time? I don't know.
A traumatised person may not seem like her usual self, or may be hypervigilant, on edge, or being startled by everyday things. Everyone is different. You never know what impact trauma will have. Symptoms can change from day to day. So what does all this mean, in practice, in your job? A traumatised person's brain is protecting them, but that normal human response of self-protection can get in the way of evidence gathering. The US military has developed new trauma-informed interviewing techniques that you can use to work around this. Research shows that if someone seems vacant, they could be distracted by their traumatic memories. Try to ground them by asking a simple, non-patronising question such as, "Are you thirsty? Do you want a glass of water?" This can help bring them back to the here and now. Don't expect a logical, linear story. Ask, "What can you recall just now?" Find out what the victim physically felt or saw. Working this way, from the instinctive sensory parts towards the logical parts of the brain, you'll get more results. In conclusion, 4 things for you to take away. Trauma response is the brain in survival mode. Repeated abuse can make trauma symptoms worse. In response to trauma, people will behave in unexpected ways. Remember, trauma is a normal human response to abnormal events.
We know that you've gone through a really painful experience, but we need to take a statement to understand what happened on Saturday night.
Are you able to tell us anything that you remember about his flat? Anything at all?
A dog. Barking.
Are you able to remember any physical sensations or feelings that you had?
Cigarette smoke. I can smell it now.
What was going through your mind?
I couldn't understand it. I just couldn't move, or even scream.
To freeze is a perfectly normal response. So you start with the memories, you don't start at the beginning. You have to engage with our feelings to get to the facts.
Makes sense. Check you, Professor, getting all sciencey on us.
Well, if it gets us usable evidence.
There's life in the old dog yet.
Oi.
Any thoughts from the video? Wow. Does it help connect some of those dots a little bit about the behaviors you may be seeing? And we often know sometimes a fair amount, but often really only a very little about what the people in our communities have been through and are dealing with. So, yes. Oh, yes. I was going to say, I hope you haven't been glassed in a bar. That very different for those of you who couldn't hear, he was sharing that he's spent time in Scotland and it was traumatizing, just kind of thinking back to, you know, different parts of the culture and how much drinking is a part of that. Daniel. Yes, I absolutely, literally you can do Google trauma and the brain and it should come up, but I will make sure that I include the link when I share the slides. Yes. Yeah, I'm curious if the person who asked that might want to come off mic and share a little more. Can't see everyone on the screen. If that is of interest, great. If not, okay too. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Knowing for 50 years to recognize those trauma and how to start engaging.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
I think the victim's demeanor, like not remembering the time. A lot of times you hear victims say things like, "Oh, it was like an out of body experience."
Mm-hmm.
They like remove themselves from the physical reality of what's going on in order to survive it.
Right, right. Yes, so comments were about that dissociation and that physically separate, mentally separating yourself physically from what's going on as a protective mechanism and recognizing the signs of trauma, particularly as faith leaders, so that we can find ways of engaging in conversation, helping connect people to the appropriate resources, providing that safe refuge really for people who might not have anybody else that they trust to speak to about these things. So how can we become more available for that? Yes, Jerry.
Open-ended questions, not directed, and allowing the person to guide the conversation from their perspective of power gathering.
Absolutely. Jerry said asking open-ended questions, not directive questions. Meet people where they are. Let them take you where they need to go. And with that guidance and that compassion And that being open and really actively listening, that starts the healing process right then and there. Daniel, did you have another comment? Okay. Yes, yes. And I'm thinking the comment about annihilate, what that brings to mind for me probably falls more in that fight mechanism where the response is one of, whether it be to the death, right? Fighting for survival. I've not really heard of annihilate in a separate way. So I'm not sure if the individual had anything else they wanted to add there. If not, we might keep moving on. Let me know if it comes back up. So I'd ask you to think about what are the things you're already doing to support someone you know has experienced some form of trauma. Shout it out, holler it out. How do you support traumatic experiences? Yes.
Understanding the aspect of generational
Mm-hmm.
And how she is experiencing her life and how that experience works with her child.
Mm-hmm. Pastor Jerry was saying she and her husband are hosting a refugee with a young child and paying attention to that generational impact of trauma and how their experiences are different based on age and relationship. Absolutely. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, that it's not their fault, that they're safe, that they didn't deserve what happened to them, that respecting boundaries. A lot of times people's choice is taken away, but because we're trying to be helpful and we think we know what's best for them, but the bottom line should always be empowerment and choice, helping people see options, supporting even if it may be a choice we don't agree with, but supporting that that's their decision, right? With taking more power away from people is the opposite of what we want to do. We want to be reducing re-traumatization and reducing re-victimization. Yes. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Having opportunity for people who share similar types of trauma to be together and to share that commonality. It helps normalize, it helps validate, it helps to speak to someone who understands the dynamics of that particular problem. Absolutely. All great, great examples. Yes. Yes.
So that's not all of who they are.
Absolutely.
Encourage that as well. This is not how to define the whole life. Part of your life, but it's not the whole life.
That's right. Not defining people by their trauma. And a lot of that goes back to language, right? We don't say rape victim. We should say someone who's experienced rape, because that means it's something that happened to me, not that I'm defined by being a victim of rape, right? Yes, Daniel.
Listening without judgment and without
Absolutely. Not trying to fix it, listening without judgment, walking with someone, meeting them where they're at. I often think about it's more of a dance, right? I don't know which way you're going to go next, but I'm going to try to be there with you in the most present, non-judgmental, supportive, healing, caring way that I can. And believe me, as a rape trauma advocate, I responded to calls and was stunned every single time at how much someone allowed me as a perfect stranger to be there in their most painful time. And why was that? Because I got out of bed in the middle of the night and came to be there, no questions asked, and to help them navigate the system. And you would think a stranger in that process would be the least that someone would want, right? But it's because I showed up without that judgment and was able to be there regardless of what decision they made. They didn't want to press charges, they did, they didn't. To help be present for someone as they're moving through. Jerry, yes. The ministry of presence. Absolutely. Absolutely. So I encourage you to think about, again, it's about supporting choice and recognizing that predictability, routine is helpful. Surprises can often be difficult for people with trauma histories. Yes, Daniel.
Is there any reason to assume that there's anyone therefore shouldn't we be treating everyone?
Absolutely. Great point. And that is exactly a concept that is part of being trauma informed, is recognizing the prevalence of trauma and traumatic experiences, and not assuming that everyone is the walking wounded, but assuming that because we know how prevalent it is and how many different things can create and impact trauma, a trauma-informed mindset is one going into every situation being mindful that it is common. And if we recognize it's common, we can help again break down those barriers of shame and silence. So absolutely, it's actually a universal understanding. When you understand the science and you understand the prevalence, you do that. You assume that more people have had experiences of trauma than not, and it sets a different foundation and a different stage. So excellent point. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Knowing more about the impact of trauma more beneficially when it comes to the decisions that we make.
Absolutely, great points. Thinking about the impacts of trauma, paying more attention to it, being more mindful in big decisions that we're making, how some of the decisions that are being made we know may create trauma for people, but our role is trying to reduce that trauma and reducing re-traumatization of people. And we do that by coming to the table trauma informed. So some quick examples of how you can help with in the moment, help people build resilience, help regulate. Traumatic experiences are very dysregulating. So thinking about, that's where prayer is particularly helpful, why meditation and mindfulness is more and more useful, and more people are practicing it now. Paying attention to our breath. Doing breath work is a grounding tool. It helps you get back into your body if you've dissociated or if those self-protective mechanisms are kicking in. So there's lots of things. I mean, one of my favorite is that yoga is now used in more schools than detention, which, yeah, should we not have been doing that all along, right? Give tools for calming, give tools for being present in my body. Don't put something in a punitive punishing, which is going to likely cause more trauma, right? So lots of easy things we can do. I have one of those adult coloring books, Dr. Seuss, all the time. There's lots of easy things that we can activate here. So let's move into talking about the adverse childhood experiences study. Raise your hand on chat or in the room if you've been introduced to this topic before. About half of the people in the room have. I'm not sure if we can get a hand count in the Zoom world. If you have not heard about ACEs, you can go to a website called PACES, PACES.com, pacesconnection.com. It started off as ACEs Connection. It's an international online forum that has all of the science, but it also has different communities. So I have a screenshot of, there is a faith-based ACEs community through this collaborative. There are people that are talking about different things they've done in their states, in the military, and with first responders. Pretty hard to not find a group that's talking on pacesconnection.com. And through that website, you can have, chats and forums with others that are looking at how can I build this into my faith community? How can we integrate some of these practices and understandings? And they also, if we were all in the same place, I would have done a poll or an interactive exercise where I ask you to actually complete the ACEs questionnaire for yourself. There is also a resilience questionnaire, and I can send this with the slides. because anytime we're talking about adverse childhood experiences, we always need to be talking about resilience. It goes back to what the lady said earlier about we're not defined by the trauma that happens to us, but by the resilience that hopefully people are helping us strengthen and regain as we move through. So the adverse childhood experiences is a study that began as an obesity clinic study through Kaiser Permanente. Yes, Daniel. Okay. Oh, good. Great, great. It's become much more popular. So the study was done in the late 90s. And I would say in the last 5 years, especially, it's a conversation in more disciplines than not. So in my opinion, and I've done a lot of training on ACEs, there is no one I have come into contact with yet who could not benefit from understanding what this study showed. And the importance of it is talking about the epidemiology, really looking at what's happening, the prevalence of it, how many children are experiencing these types of adverse experiences, looking at that toxic stress and the impact on the brain, as I just showed you with some neurobiology thinking, looking at the biomedical consequences, the impact on our bodies, looking at how we're passing it from parent to child, and also increasing our resilience research. Because what's interesting is not everybody that experiences childhood trauma have the same trauma responses, right? We need to do a lot more resilience research to understand better what helped this child not be impacted in these ways as this child who experienced similar types of trauma, right? So how do we build better understanding on resilience as well? So the ACE study was initially an obesity study that Dr. Vince Felitti here in San Diego was conducting out of Kaiser Permanente. He had individuals that were being very successful with weight loss and then putting it back on. One of the first patients in that original study eventually disclosed a history of incest, which was what led to her putting the weight back on. And she helped Dr. Felitti understand that she was physically trying to change the way her body looked to protect herself from anybody sexually abusing her again. So Dr. Felitti went, wait a minute, whoa, I didn't even think about that correlation. And it grew into a long-term study that he did with Robert Anda, who's an epidemiologist with the Centers for Disease Control. So what they did was create this ACEs survey, which the original survey has 10 questions on it. What you do to complete the survey is identify out of these 10 categories, how many things did I experience between birth and age 18? So it's not, if I was a child who was physically abused, it's not how many times I was physically abused. It's that I was physically abused gives me one of the 10 scores. If I experienced emotional or sexual abuse, those are other categories. If I lived in a household where my mother was treated violently, or with an adult in the household who was a substance abuser. If I lived with someone that experienced mental illness, again, not uncommon. If I experienced separation or divorce, or if I had an incarcerated household family member. And then the other categories are what fall under neglect, either emotional or physical. So if you're completing the survey, you say, I have an ACE score of 5 because I experienced emotional abuse, mother treated violently, physical neglect, parents divorced, and I also had a family member with mental illness. So the important thing about the ACE study is that 17,000 people through the Kaiser system in Southern California completed the survey. And then Rob Anda and Vince Felitti looked at their medical records and started to make correlations between the higher the ACE score, the more they saw the negative physical health outcomes and the connections between that early trauma, particularly not having any intervention, and how people were suffering and holding on to that trauma in their bodies. What's also important to think about with the ACEs study is this is the stats of that original 17,000. And ACEs are common. So if this is based on a study that was primarily white, well-educated people that had access to good health care, and the ACE numbers were this common, with more than 60% of that 17,000 having at least one ACE, and almost a fourth of that 17,000 people having 3 or more. If those were the numbers in a white, well-educated, good access to healthcare sample, what do you think the numbers are going to look like for people that are in marginalized and vulnerable populations, for people that are experiencing poverty, for people that are experiencing racism, all of the above, right? That's going to compound these negative impacts that much further. So there's a lot of detail that if you're interested in learning more about the correlations between ACEs, you can find both on the CDC website, but also on PACE's Connection. But here's just one that helps us recognize that depression we talked about earlier, that anxiety, that use of substances to try to numb the pain. These are from further studies beyond the original ACE study. There's been a lot of other work done, looking at the higher my ACE score, the more likely I am to be experiencing these different mental health impacts. So if we're recognizing symptoms, even if we're not a medical professional or a psychological professional, we're going to be able to have some of these conversations that let people know we understand this is common and that there is help available and that we're here to help connect them to the appropriate resources. The ACEs study also really linked to some of these things that we talked about earlier related to problems with attention and concentration and other self-destructive behaviors. You know, I'm putting myself more at risk because I'm just feeling this badly about myself, those high levels of anxiety and that low self-esteem. So paying attention to, I mean, this is difficult and this is sad, and I know that this is heavy, so I want to pay attention to that. It's important that we don't define people by their ACE score, but giving a number to this is a common set of experiences that lots of other people also went through. And lots of other people had heart disease or COPD or diabetes. I was astounded when I first really started digging into ACEs and looking at it is throughout our body. Our immune systems are shut down by the increased level of stress and the cortisol stress hormone that is created by trauma. So that's why there's a connection to arthritis, right? Who would have thought that arthritis has a tie to childhood adverse experiences? When you start to better understand what chronic trauma does to the body, that's where these connections come in. So we in the state of California are very lucky that we have Nadine Burke-Harris, the Surgeon General. She's a pediatrician from San Francisco who dug into ACEs herself and has been instrumental in forcing this to be an issue that medical professionals are screening for and other professions are screening for. Because look at this, ACEs dramatically increase the risk for 9 out of 10 leading causes of death in the United States. If we're not putting our attention behind ACEs when you see those numbers, then we have a serious problem. So there's a report that came out last year called the Roadmap to Resilience. And part of the work here, and this is, I appreciate is sounding more medical than maybe you feel relevant to faith communities, but again, it's to show you that the prevalence of what people in our faith communities are experiencing is not often recognized by the medical professionals. So if we are better able to say, look at, we have high populations experiencing cancer and strokes and Alzheimer's, how do we help make these connections? Because it's very liberating and it's actually very powerful from people that I have worked with who really dissected, this is what my ACE score was. To make sense of, all right, so this is kind of the path that my life took because of that adversity. And because I wasn't taught how to do healthy parenting or what a healthy relationship looks like or what healthy communication is. So there's a lot more that you can understand about the medical connections and the physical connections to ACEs. But the bottom line is the research shows that the higher your ACE score, literally the shorter your lifespan may be without these types of appropriate interventions. Without psychological support, without medical support, without parenting support. Yes. It's addiction. There is a tremendous cause with addiction, connection with addiction. And so that has been shown that people that have more addictive tendencies and are using substances to numb that pain absolutely typically have pretty significant trauma histories. So that connection has been shown in lots of different research. Absolutely, great point. So my hope here is that, again, we're not trying to terrify people by saying, I have a high ACE score, this means I'm going to die early, right? But it's about giving people that context and helping them find meaning in what they've been experiencing, why they are having these health outcomes, and how can we change that trajectory so that we can connect them to more healing mechanisms, more holistic mechanisms, more support in our communities. So here's part of what you asked earlier, that as the ACE score goes up, the findings from different surveys do show that this also leads to job productivity problems, which sadly is one of the ways that I get people to sign on to paying attention to this, because it's impacting the bottom line of my company or my corporation, right? Maybe we can shift that so that it's, I care about the physical and mental health of my team, and I want to be more knowledgeable about how common this is, but it contributes to all of these things that we've talked about this morning. So I share this graphic is in the roadmap to resilience that Nadine Burke-Harris, the Surgeon General, and her team put out last year. We're trying, she is helping with lots of free training on ACEs, helping Medi-Cal providers be reimbursed for doing ACEs screenings, which can then connect people to the appropriate, many, many different referrals in the medical system. But it's really looking at, again, those epigenetic changes that happen when our DNA and our biology is interrupted and impacted by trauma. So there are protective factors that are always part of helping children and adults. We need to pay attention to, there's the physical side of this. There's for spiritual injuries is absolutely a piece of this. One of my colleagues, Victor Veith, is a former child abuse prosecutor based in Minnesota. He has done a tremendous amount of work. He actually also recently went to seminary and has been trying to help people understand the impact of spiritual injuries based on having undergone interpersonal violence. Now, that may be someone who was abused by someone in the clergy or in their congregation. It may be someone who's just wondering, how could God let something like this happen to me, right? So spiritual injuries is a piece that you all are very, very familiar with, and is part of where I think you can be really instrumental in, again, helping everybody better understand the mind, body, and spirit impacts of trauma and resilience, right? Because spirituality, as I said earlier, and faith is also one of those things that people grab onto and hold on to and help them get through these most difficult times in their lives. So the important thing to pay attention to is ACEs can be prevented. We can do a better job of putting more support around our communities, whether that be better paying jobs or more affordable childcare, talking about what healthy parenting is, providing opportunities for education and these types of discussions and resource sharing, helping lessen harm and prevent future risk. And I'm happy to share these slides with anybody that would like them. I know there's a ton of information we're going through here. So is it Rosemary? You and I were having a conversation earlier about finding that meaning, right? And going through difficult times. And so Dr. Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, I read years and years and years ago. And it's another one that stopped me in my tracks, both the ability to come out of something as horrible as the Holocaust and be able to find meaning in it, but also that conversation about, in the most desperate and difficult of times, my choice is even if all my power has been taken away, my choice is still part of my freedom. So forces beyond your control can take away everything you possess except for one thing, your freedom to choose how you will respond to the situation. But think about that with everything I've just talked about, with the impacts of trauma. Do you feel that people that have experienced trauma feel like they have that choice? Not if they freeze. Yes. Depends on the support around them. Absolutely. Which is where building trauma-informed, faith-based communities is so important and so critical, because we want people to be feeling empowered again. And disempowerment is what violence and trauma is all about, right? And it takes time. It's similar to grief. There is no direct route to heal from trauma. So we need to show up the best way we can, how often we can, in as many different ways as we can, and not be afraid of the conversation, not be afraid of where that conversation may take us. But as many of you mentioned, being present, and literally, sometimes it's not really about saying anything at all, but witnessing and sitting and sharing in that pain. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Tell me more.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that to be just a real grounding place for working with people in the congregations.
Yes.
No matter what story they're telling,
Right.
because it invites more of their understanding of what they're experiencing.
Absolutely. She's sharing about Dr. Edith Egger, who has also worked with Dr. Frankel and asking people to tell me more, and inviting and being available for them to share what next they want to share, without a lot of those very specific questions that often end up being more narrowing of a conversation and the building of relationships. So that's an excellent point. So this is a infographic that came out more recently. The tree demonstrates more of those original ACE categories, kind of the things that are happening in early childhood. The roots of the tree are showing more about what's happening in our communities, whether it be poverty or racism or substandard schools that are contributing, that are, again, those root causes of some of the trauma. And then more recently, I'm really glad to see people making the connection to climate trauma and everything that's going on in the physical environment. I mean, just look at in the last week with Hurricane Ida and the flooding in Japan and Europe, right? We can't turn a blind eye to this anymore. And it's absolutely compounding if I'm already experiencing other difficulties. And then my home is lost to a wildfire or a tornado or whatever the natural disaster may be. So this is part of looking at a social ecological model that pays attention to individually what's happening, community what's happening, and on a broader, larger scale. And just having those conversations about the interconnections. Again, you can find all of this. You can see this is from ACE's Connection before they changed their name, but a ton of resources. So the other thing that Nadine Burke-Harris talks about is it's important that we know about ACEs. This is the pediatrician, now our Surgeon General. She also has an excellent TED Talk, which is a great way to break down ACEs a little bit more. But what can we do about ACEs? How do we build resilience? Well, we talk about sleep and exercise and good nutrition, but are we making that accessible? Are we providing opportunities for that? Are we having a yoga class, in our congregation? Are we opening that up for all ages? I mean, just thinking about mindfulness, talking about what mental health supports and what mental health is. We talk about illness a lot. Let's talk about health. Looking at how we can decrease the level of stress hormones that are activating through our bodies, reduces the inflammation. It increases our body's ability, that neuroplasticity where our brains are so amazingly able to heal. They can't erase what was done, but adding more of these stress reduction techniques can be tremendously powerful. Some of my other favorite examples are equine therapy, right? People that are finding that connection with horses or other animals, or gardening, or through music or art. Again, spirituality. There's just so many things here that are healing and nurturing and restorative. So that's where we talk about resilience and really looking at resilience. It breaks my heart when people talk about being born with a certain amount of it. The first time I heard that, I was just blown away. Because we don't get a certain amount of resilience that gets used up. right? You might feel disconnected from your strength and your empowerment and your resilience. And that's again where we can come in and be allies and supporters and healers. But we have to look at resilience in the physical realm, in the emotional realm, in the mental realm, and in the spiritual realm. So what comes to mind for you when you think about spirituality and resilience? Just shoot some words out for me. Faith? Flexibility? Balance, absolutely. Great answers. Hope? Community? Relationships? Trust? Support? All of the above. Tolerance? Renewal? Connectedness? Not just tolerance, but acceptance. Pushing ourselves out of our own comfort zone in order to better understand someone else's experience. So resilience is about dealing with crises effectively, not just getting through it, not just making lemonade out of lemons, but in processing it, in recognizing what impacts the trauma that we experienced had on us, making meaning of it, finding ways to move through it and be successful and positive and growing, not again defined by what happens to me. The goal is always about helping people get back feeling that sense of control and that strength internally. Futures Without Violence is another great resource. I think, again, this is actually quite an old infographic, but it really does a nice job of helping people recognize that protective factors are everywhere, that they can be individual components and individual interactions we're having, or they can be what's happening in our families, in our communities. So we want to activate all of these levels, and we want to help people think about what's at my disposal in these different ways. What are some resources maybe I didn't know of or I wasn't interested in taking advantage of before, but my pastor was talking about it, so maybe I'm a little more willing to kind of give that a try. The other thing is really thinking about thriving is not the cessation of symptoms. Thriving is not, I'm over and done with that. Thriving means processing, understanding, interpreting, making sense of. And that again, always goes back to empowerment. If I'm working with someone who has a trauma history and they say, well, I'm gonna do it because Sandi said it would be a good idea, I've totally missed the boat, right? It is about them feeling connected to strength and self and empowerment, with me there as a support and someone who's willing to walk with them along the way. So I know that oftentimes hearing about all of the levels of trauma can be really depressing and difficult ourselves. So I want to share the example of this young lady that I'm pictured here with is Lauren Book, who is a child sexual abuse survivor that spoke at one of IVAT summits a few years ago. She had the experience of being abused by a female nanny, which is less common. And so she was talking, so I'm going to pause for a minute because it's really loud with a plane going overhead. Lauren came and talked about that experience of being alienated even within her own family because she was not able, sorry, thank you so much for helping close the door. Just got so loud. So what happened is Lauren couldn't tell people what was going on herself. A friend of hers noticed that she was engaging in self-harm. She was cutting her arms. That friend went to a school counselor who called her parents in, and then Lauren was able to say, this is what's happening to me. Her mother had mental illness and was pretty absent, and her father was supporting the family and was not at home very much. But he, upon hearing this, immediately rallied, immediately helped. They went to the police. Lauren's abuser ended up being convicted and serving time, still writing letters to Lauren from jail. But Lauren said, I am not going to let this define me. I am not going to let this be the end of my story. Lauren is now a state senator in Florida. She's done a lot of work with the Parkland students around gun violence. She's created a program that the entire state of Florida uses in, I think, elementary schools, it might be beyond, to help kids know who is safe to talk to if they are being harmed. And you all as members of faith community are a big piece of that again. She's also helped change the laws around the statute of limitations in the state of Florida so that survivors can disclose for longer periods of time and still seek justice. So the goal is to move from victim to survivor to thriver, right? The hope is to get beyond just, this is what happened to me. Yes, sir. The question is if she was self-driven and not letting it define her, or if she had professional support. She did have professional psychological support, which she talked about. You know, it takes a while to be ready for that. So that's absolutely a piece of the process, and understanding when people might not be ready to take that step yet, and just gently reminding them that, you know, I can do this much from my role and my vantage point, but it's really important for us to introduce you to some others. And it may not always be just talk therapy, right? Again, a lot of people being in a support group with others who've experienced similar things can be incredibly beneficial. It's about having that safe place to talk without people making you feel shameful about it. So, but it's a combination. I've worked with a lot of people that have never taken advantage of the professional help, and you know, that's not the only answer, but it's certainly an important piece. Thank you for that question. Yes.
Yeah, some cultures have taboos about sharing your personal business outside the family. How can faith leaders help the victim overcome that?
That's a great question. Some cultures having taboos about sharing problems that you might be having in the family outside of the family. That's very, very, very common. So I think that one simple way, and that's asking to unpack a lot because that's a complicated question. But one simple way is to show respect for the culture and the tradition, but to focus on what it is making that individual feel, right? So for example, I have done a lot of training with helping people learn that forcing a child to give a hug to an uncle, to a grandpa, to an auntie is not a way to teach a child body autonomy. But it can be seen as very disrespectful if I don't do that to my elder or to whomever has, you know, that level of respect in the family. So it's conversation, it's talking, it's if they aren't ever hearing the other side of it, if they aren't ever hearing that in my culture, that's, you know, we do this differently, we talk about it differently. Again, it's about creating a place to talk where there's not shame, where it's not, well, that's a horrible cultural tradition, but that kind of contributing to secrecy often keeps people in cycles of violence for very long periods of time. So finding other people that are able to kind of have these conversations and again, normalize it. The more we're bringing it up, the more we're talking about it, and the more we're showing respect. But also, I always go back to, but this is what this individual is experiencing and the harm that that individual is experiencing. Yes, you said.
I think that's a very good point. A lot of times we see these self-help and social help programs, and they're very westernized.
Mm-hmm.
They're very human.
Yes.
So you come from an African tradition or Indian tradition or Indian tradition.
Yep.
It is shame.
Yep.
What happens is block this for them, and now this person with trauma does not want to cross that line because they're going to experience more trauma trying to leave.
Right.
So that's very good.
Absolutely. Paying attention to culture and non-Western ways of healing and incorporating how families and communities operate is so key. And I think, I mean, that's a great suggestion. There should be a conversation about how are different cultures addressing the violence and the trauma that is part of our world. And how do we do that in a way that is understanding of different indigenous beliefs? And absolutely, I think conversation, right? And there is not one right answer, but if someone is being harmed, if my core is not feeling supported and safe and loved, something's got to give here, right? And so we got to push, we got to gently push, in my opinion. So post-traumatic growth is the other piece to really think about, whether healing is possible, healing is powerful. We always need to focus on hope, which was raised earlier. Post-traumatic growth is helping people see that there is, I don't like the light at the end of the tunnel sort of imagery so much as this is not all that I am. This is not the only type of experience that's going to drive the rest of my life, right? Post-traumatic growth is being able to understand, here's some new skills I learned through therapy, through yoga, through mindfulness, that help me deal with the stress and the flashbacks, or just those negative thoughts and images that come to mind. Understanding trauma is not just about gaining knowledge, but actually changing our view of the world. And again, I see you as faith leaders as being so instrumental in doing this and being able to provide that opportunity to talk about what kind of world do we want to be? What kind of community do we want to create? How do we want to put more love and support and nurturance out there to, mitigate some of this violence and terrorism and pain that is surrounding us in so many ways. So post-traumatic growth really looks at how do people start to recognize an appreciation for life again, right? How am I making that shift to, I'm not scared and terrified and isolating, but I reached out to my faith community and I had positive responses and I had people checking in on me and I had people paying attention to, you don't seem like you're yourself today, Sandi. Is there something that I can do? Tell me more. You tell me, make it safe. Again, the relationships with others, being hopeful about new possibilities and other things yet to come, not only thinking about what happened and what is in the past, continuing to kind of make me feel stuck. Again, recognizing that personal strength and that spiritual change. Going through difficult times is painful, but is part of that critical process of growth, right? And if people are there willing to talk with me about that and not downplay it, not say that I did something wrong to contribute to it, but just recognize that that was a horrible thing that shouldn't have happened to me, is incredibly powerful healing. So post-traumatic growth is all about adding more to the positivity currency in our lives than what we tend to do, which is focus on the negative when we're experiencing something difficult or traumatic, or feeling like, here we go again, again, I thought I was making strides and now this bad thing came up. Now COVID hit, now blah, 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 blah. How do we kind of really help infuse more connections, relationship building, networking, positivity, things that I didn't even know to ask about, right? Opportunities that we as members of community can make more available than maybe somebody was even aware of before. So I've talked about some of this already, and I'm looking at the time, so I want to be mindful of, please do let me know if there's other questions you have as we continue through this. But trauma-informed care is really about an approach that you do recognize that universal understanding of the amount of trauma in the world and stopping the blaming victimization attitude of what's wrong with you, but thinking more about what happens to you. So trauma-informed practices are paying attention to the science, as we talked about, looking at ensuring that cultural competence, now often referred to as cultural humility, recognizing that I don't know a lot about what someone from a different culture's taboos are or what they can and cannot do. So let's engage in more conversation around that. Let's learn, let's educate, let's help each other better understand. Again, constantly focusing on control for that individual, helping with them feeling that they do have autonomy, that they do have power, that this isn't I'm being told to do something, but somebody's helping me navigate through what happens next. Integrating care. SDRIC is a great example of that. How can you all from different faiths and different ways of being in religious community work together and help each other in ways that isn't happening in other communities and parts of the world? And always recognizing that recovery is possible. So this is the screenshot I mentioned of what is part of what is on PACES Connection, specifically for faith leaders who want to look at how can I integrate some of this ACEs knowledge into my work and my community. They're constantly updating this. It's been around for quite a few years now, and it's every time I go on it, there is a tremendous amount of new work. So I hope this can be a new resource for you and your community. Trauma-informed care, as we've talked about, is about realizing that this is widespread and prevalent, recognizing that if someone's acting out or being really argumentative, something's going on there, right? Particularly if that's not typically how I engage with you. But rather than shutting me down or saying, well, that's negative, you know, gently try to find out a little more, or at least let people know you're available when they're ready. Responding by recognizing that it's not only about individual reactions, but you can organizationally become trauma informed. There's a lot of mechanisms and ways to help you do this. So it might be important to think about kind of starting in interpersonal individual reactions, but how do I build my community to be thinking about trauma-informed, trauma-responsive mindsets, paradigms, you know, constantly building that. Trainings like this is a great start. And resisting those ways that sometimes, even though we're trying to do good, we contribute to the re-traumatization of someone. And, you know, like I said before, I don't need to know your whole story to know that you went through something really hard. If you want to share it with me, I'll be here. And sometimes we have to figure out how to support ourselves in absorbing a lot of that pain, right? We need to take care of self as well. But resisting those ways of re-traumatizing people are key. So really looking at, sometimes there's challenges to being trauma-informed, sometimes there's resistance, sometimes it's difficult because of the trauma histories and the people in your own congregations that just aren't ready to sign on to do this. So giving people space, giving people grace, giving people that protection, recognizing that I'm here when you're ready is a huge, huge piece of this. So again, it's about empowerment, it's about recognizing boundaries, it's about recognizing privacy, communicating with compassion, thinking about, again, how do we build trust? How do we embrace diversity? How do we respect that these aren't just often seen as women's rights issues, but as human rights issues? This is what we want everyone to be surrounded with. Holistically creating community. So here's some questions to think about as far as building trauma-informed congregations. The very first step is looking at the science, like we've spent some time doing today. Being more aware of what the research is showing us about the impacts of trauma and how to be, you know, showing up, ready to do our homework and recognizing this is impacting each and every one of us in different ways. So how does that adversity impact a person specifically, a family, an entire group? Looking again at that language, what happened to you, not what's wrong with you. Are you, Daniel, wanting to tell me something? Okay, great. Shoot one at me.
Okay. Two folks were asking about that. I started asking keep them stuck in their story, give me advice.
Great question. So asking someone to share their story can sometimes inherently be re-traumatizing. So how do you do that in a way to be mindful of not wanting to do that? By letting people know you are there when they are ready to talk. Instead of saying, I'm here, I'm ready now to listen to your story. Being available, being present, letting people know that you recognize that it can be difficult to share that again, and that your intention is to do everything you can to not have it be an interaction that creates additional trauma. Being really forthcoming about it is really, in my opinion, one of the best ways to do it. Because if I'm sitting down and I'm thinking, I kind of want to talk to Yusuf about this, Yusuf says, okay, ready, let's go. I want to hear all about it. That might be a little much for me, right? I might not quite be ready. But if Yusuf says, Sandi, I'm here when you're ready. I'm here when you are ready to let me know whatever you'd like to let me know. That immediately tells me I get to guide this, I get to set the pace, and that is where the reduction of re-traumatization and re-victimization can occur. Is there another question?
Yeah, I hope I get this right. The question is about the faith leader over the shares with each other. We'll try to do those that you're in.
Mhm.
Do you run a risk of
That's a great question. If we self-disclose as a faith leader, are we contributing to possible re-traumatization in someone who might have had a similar experience? I think that's great insight to be concerned about that possibility. And I think that, you know, I often see that in my work where when I was training people to be domestic violence and sexual assault advocates, they often had been victimized themselves and they wanted to be advocates to make sure it didn't happen to anyone else. But there's a process that you have to be able to go through so that you're being helpful and you're not instead layering on my stuff to your stuff. So in saying that, I think disclosing is powerful and again, helps normalize. It helps to hear that I'm not the only one that's been through that experience, but you want to be mindful that you probably don't need to be tremendously full of detail. And you probably need to be mindful. And as I said before, I would start off by saying, this may be difficult for others to hear, and please take care of yourself. Putting it out there that way really, I think, allows for people to say, okay, this is a little too much for me. And so I'm going to separate right now. But it also opens up the door to take some of that shame away, especially if it's about learning. This is what I learned from my experience that I hope can be helpful for others. Is that any other questions? Okay, I hope that I answered those. Thank you for the questions. So some of this again is what was coming up in the questions: practicing self-regulation, recognizing that we ourselves can be charged and triggered by different things. And so being more aware of those autonomic responses, those biological responses, and what have we found that's helpful, you know, to calm myself down, to get me into a place where I can be an active listener and I can be present for you instead of kind of worried and stuck in what's going on for me. And looking at how we can incorporate these strategies into liturgy, fellowship events, rituals in your different congregations. Again, looking at actively building and sustaining relationships. If you're acknowledging trauma versus acting like trauma doesn't exist, you are creating place for people to feel safe to start to talk to you about it. If it's something that feels taboo and that you're uncomfortable hearing about, then we have a lot of work to do. And that's natural and that's okay. I don't want people to feel shamed for having difficulty with it, but we have to practice how to be present and how to have it not be about us, but about what we can offer and support others with. Thinking about, again, someone earlier said it's not about fixing someone's problem. Usually if that's our instinct, that's a really good time to take a pause and say, how can I rephrase this so that I'm offering a suggestion versus making it sound like I can fix a very complicated problem for someone. And again, a lot of times that comes from very good intention, but it can be felt as disempowering because you're not really hearing me. A quick fix or one part of the solution is not really going to make this better. And it makes me actually feel like you don't quite understand the complexity of what I'm dealing with. Or maybe your thought on how to handle this isn't what I know is best for me. Modeling and practicing self-care is another really key piece. How you are doing that, how you are modeling that, demonstrating it, prioritizing it, building time into your day and your families to practice it, building time in your events to practice it. So looking at other ways of having trauma-informed faith communities is, again, recognizing the mental health concerns attached to traumatic experiences. And that, unfortunately, people are often misdiagnosed because the trauma is not labeled or identified or understood, especially with kids. The over-medication of children and adults is a big piece of this because we're not asking the right questions. We're not asking about what contributed to these behaviors and these symptoms. We're kind of just trying to label, and throw some medicine on it, right? And you all know very well, that's not what healing is about. That's management. That's management of symptoms. That's not unpacking of root causes of trauma. Empowering community members. So a lot of what I pulled here in the faith-based specific slides is from different faith communities saying, here's how we've started to do the work. And we have to be careful that we're not making it overly simplified. Just pull yourself up by your bootstraps sort of mentality, right? A lot of people experience that to be very demeaning. That doesn't recognize the struggles I'm going through. That's just telling me to chin up and get over it, right? And also not saying just pray, 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 pray. Prayer is a piece of it, but prayer is not, again, that doesn't solve everything. It doesn't resolve everything. It doesn't instantly make things better. So just again, being careful about how we're talking about what our language is doing to either be supportive or contributing to stigmatizing people. This is what someone raised earlier about universal trauma precautions mean recognizing. If we were to raise our hand and share our ACE scores, there would be a lot of trauma in this room. I would project based on what we know from how much violence and interpersonal violence is happening, collective and community violence. So really paying attention to, I can be trauma informed even if you never tell me that you've experienced trauma. By the way that I communicate, by the way that I look at what's the surroundings are in the room, by paying attention to safety, by not making people feel blocked in or forced to talk about something. All of these are ways of recognizing that you may not ever tell me what happened, but I'm doing my best to come to the table demonstrating that I recognize that trauma is a pervasive experience in all of our worlds. So safety is key, looking at both physical, emotional, and relational safety. I know we're right at our time here, so I want to be mindful of everyone's time. Looking at power dynamics, these are some questions to think about. Again, good intentions. Are you keeping confidences when you start a prayer chain, for example? Are you asking permission to, I hope so. I would assume many of you do this, but it's also, again, out of that, I want to help someone. Do I share more information about a member of my community than they wanted me to share? And did that just decrease some trust there versus my goal of trying to help have more people helping and being available to be supportive? Looking at, how are you incorporating and involving people in these teachings? How are you utilizing the wisdom from people with lived experiences and sharing their stories in ways that are, again, restorative and healing, and having conversations about how to do that? Paying attention to, as we've talked about, culture, does this help or hinder when we talk about different cultural responses to different types of violence and abuse? And how are we prioritizing listening? How are we paying attention to giving as much opportunity for voice and choice to all members of our community? How are we recognizing, that not everybody knows how to unpack systemic racism and sexism and discrimination in all these different forms? And how are we finding ways of celebrating cultural differences, gender differences, all of the above? How do we help people self-identify, and how do we show respect for that? So some of the things I encourage you to think about are, what are the examples of trauma you're seeing in your community? Some of it might be very apparent, and some of it might be, you need to just be paying attention a little bit more. How can your faith community better address what we know from the ACEs study, which, again, I went through very quickly. So I encourage you to learn more about it, because there's a lot that we can do that's age appropriate. We can start talking about things with young people in ways that they can understand and better know, this is not what should be happening to me. This is not love. This is not what people that are here to protect me are supposed to be doing. Looking at ways we can individually and collectively reduce the stigma around trauma. Looking at our words, looking at our policies, looking at how are we inviting people to these conversations, and specifying ways we can address trauma and mental health concerns in our worship. How are you already doing that? What are some ways that you're already addressing trauma in your communities? Anyone want to share? How are you already talking about trauma? Jerry?
Prior to the pandemic, we were in the middle of discussing ACEs
Mm-hmm.
with a small group that are educators, parents, as well as those who just wanted to know more.
Small group discussions and small group work is absolutely key with parents, with educators, with members of the community, people who want to know more. And exactly, having it be an ongoing conversation, right? There's a lot to learn here and there's a lot to share. So be proactive about not having it just be one time a year we talk about this. Help bring in people who are able to facilitate those conversations and really share that critical info. Yes. Sure, absolutely. Well, trauma stewardship is another great resource it's basically thinking about care for caregivers. So I encourage you to take a look at that resource as well. And because we were gonna break into small groups and talk about better understanding trauma-informed care with different ages, I included some resources here. So the National Child Traumatic Stress Network has information for faith leaders on working with child trauma, as does SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, all ways of helping mitigate short and long-term impacts of trauma. So those are some resources there. You may have heard of the movie Paper Tigers, which is a documentary that Jamie Redford did about a principal in Walla Walla, Washington, who learned about ACEs, had his eyes opened about trauma. He ran one of the schools that had all the kids that were kicked out of all the other schools come to. He went back and trained up every single person in that school on ACEs and trauma, and the ways that they saw those kids shine and grow and graduate and have their mental and physical health addressed was just incredible. He also did another documentary called Resilience, both of which I think you can stream live now. And then the National Center for Elder Abuse, I also wanted to draw your attention to. This is about more how faith communities can respond to abuse of elders. And I will leave us with this. This is Rob Anda, the other co-founder of the ACE study. Our job in doing this work is to help people find meaning in what they've experienced so they can take responsibility in changing their own lives, in healing themselves, their families, and people around them, and in interrupting that intergenerational transmission of toxic stress. So I will stop there. I thank everybody. I hope we got to most of the comments and questions along the way. I appreciate your time and your attention and everything that you do so very much. Thank you for having me here today, and IVAT and myself are a resource for you. And I am happy, Daniel, to send you the slides so that everyone who would like them can pull some of this information I put together. Thank you again, everyone. Stay safe. Have a wonderful day. I don't know if anyone's making closing comments, Dan. Yes, great. Okay, let me get out of the way.
Hi, my name is Rosemary Johnston. I'm secretary of the San Diego Regional Interfaith Collaborative. And I wanted to just make some brief remarks about the work of SDRIC and how you can support it. I suspect many of you participated at least remotely, if not in person, this past weekend as we commemorated the 20th anniversary of the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks in New York, Washington, D.C., and Shanksville, Pennsylvania. As I watched television personalities interview survivors, first responders, and adult children of survivors, I was struck by the hopeful, upbeat messages each of them shared. Our God of many names can bring good out of evil, light out of darkness, and hope out of despair. And one of the positive outcomes from that day of infamy was a renewed interest and enthusiasm for interfaith relations and cooperation. Here in San Diego, a group of San Diego faith leaders returned from the Parliament of World Religions in Australia in 2011, fired up about what they had experienced in deciding to share that experience and enthusiasm with other faith leaders of various traditions in the San Diego region. And so was born the San Diego Regional Interfaith Collaborative, the sponsor of today's gathering. By bringing together faith leaders and lay leaders in the interfaith community with those on the front lines of managing critical issues that affect our community, we are able to bring support from the religious community to aid those who are working to resolve matters that negatively impact our area. We currently have more than 600 individuals on our email broadcast list. We see SDRIC as a community-based interreligious network whose purpose is to promote and facilitate cooperation among religious communities and relating organizations within the San Diego region to serve the community by sharing information and providing opportunities for communication like today's gathering. After several meetings around organizational details like developing bylaws and obtaining nonprofit status, we began offering biannual gatherings on topics such as domestic violence, climate justice, immigration, homelessness, human trafficking, law enforcement and community relations, civility and discourse, and disaster preparedness. We believe that sharing, learning, and serving together benefits everyone, and that people of faith can work together across belief systems to make San Diego a better place for all of us. We are better together. We operate with a very modest budget, which includes salaries for 3 part-time employees who help with social media, website maintenance, and events planning. And we depend on donations to plan these gatherings and to pay essential operational costs. As you listen to today's presentation, please consider making a donation toward our future efforts at www.sandiegointerfaith.org or by leaving a donation in a basket by the registration table. Thank you. And I have a closing prayer. It's from the Southeast Wisconsin Unitarian Universalist Congregation. We invoke the one we call upon in times of deep despair. We seek the one who'd answer us, respond to earnest prayer. From this source of life, we ask strength to meet an awesome task, courage in the face of fear, greater faith to persevere. But we must answer our own prayer. We must rise to tend and care. We must give and we must strive to comfort, cure, embrace, revive. So we unite to conquer fear, our homes protect, our hearts to cheer. We pray for health, we pray for love, but seek not answers from above. May we be the answer to another's prayer. Let us reach out and let us care. Amen.